And joining us now to further discuss the impact of the rising fuel prices on the business sector is Perry Ferrer, the president of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Good morning, sir, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, good morning, Danny, and thank you for having the Philippine Chamber of Commerce in your show.
Sir, give us an idea of the business's biggest concerns, most immediate concerns right now.
Well, currently, we're bracing for the impact of this rising, not only the rising fuel costs, which will affect the logistics, transportation, and also the cost of our employees to get to work, but it's the downstream effect on the rising raw materials, the supply chain impact. So that's what we're bracing for, and we hope that this conflict in the Middle East gets resolved soon.
Well, of course, we're all hoping for that, no? As I just reported, you already had your chairman pushing, of course, for the suspension of the fuel excise taxes. We see that the proposal was passed yesterday. Are you, of course, happy about this? And how does this provide relief? Is this at least something good for now? Are there any other things that you are calling for that the government can do for the businesses apart from the suspension of the fuel excise tax?
Oh, definitely, Danny. We support the suspension, the temporary suspension of the excise tax. The excise tax for gasoline, it's 10 pesos, and for diesel, it's 6. It would certainly curb the increase, but hopefully it doesn't stop with the suspension of the excise tax. We should look at what other sources of funds that can mitigate and absorb the increase. As you mentioned earlier, the increases are between 17, 20, 24 pesos. So if it's 10 pesos, that's half. Now let's look for other sources and where it can mitigate the increase or absorb the increase. Because the increase in fuel cuts across everybody, every Filipino. As you know, the Filipino businesses, I'll just touch on the businesses first, 96% or 99%, 99.6% are MSMEs.
Correct.
And 90% of that are micro. So that's over a million businesses are micro. I'm emphasizing that because these are the businesses that uses public transportation. So if the fuel, which is the one that the jeepneys, the tricycles, and the buses increase even slightly, it will certainly impact the majority of the Filipinos that go to work. So the suspension of the excise tax, that's welcome news. But hopefully it doesn't stop there, because there's another, you take out 10 pesos or 6 pesos for diesel, which most of the public transportation uses.
Correct.
And that's only half. And
Yeah.
then how about the other half? So.
And the jump in prices has already been at 1.70%. No, it's pared down, so there's still quite some risk up on the upside for oil. Sir, you mentioned that already transport, logistics, and the downstream concerns. Can you specify for us which sectors are the most vulnerable right now, which industries, and also which ones are hopefully the more resilient ones? No, are there still some bright spots here?
Yeah, from a private sector side, Danny, conserving and using efficient ways of energy is nothing new. We've done this, we've been doing this for the past couple of years when the prices of fuel started to increase, and also the cost of our raw materials and the supply chain started to increase. So it's nothing new for the manufacturing side. Where we are more concerned is on our MSMEs. This one, day to day, they live day to day, and a slight increase in fuel or transportation, we feel it when we buy our goods. So that's a very concerning pathway, and where the fuel increases will help or will hit the private sector. When it comes to the 4-day work week, it's welcome.
Yes.
And again, private sector has been implementing the 4-day work week. On the 4-day work week, the biggest beneficiary are the employees. The employees, they'll cut their transportation cost by 20%. They go to work four
Yes.
days and extend their work hours to have a full 40-hour work week. Similarly to the workers or the employees that use cars or vehicles, their own vehicles to work, it cuts down on traffic. Thank you. And also on the fuel. But what we don't really see is the jeepneys will still pasada, and the
Yeah.
buses will still go on the routes. Unfortunately, the jeepney, instead of having 14 passengers, they'll have 8. The buses,
Yeah.
instead of having 50 passengers, will have 30. So they'll have lesser income and yet paying more for their fuel.
Yeah.
So that's a balance that
Very, very
we are
tricky.
monitoring now.
Absolutely. Let's go on the topic of the 4-day work week. No, this was announced in specific LGUs and government offices. Can there possibly be a formal private sector directive, or even at least for the members of the chamber, that this 4-day work week will be implemented, or does that remain, a voluntary measure or something that the companies themselves need to decide upon?
Thank you, Danny. What we've been focusing on the private sector is implement more stringent efficiency savings and conservation measures within their businesses. We cannot mandate or make the 4-day work week compulsory, especially in healthcare. That one we
Of
need.
course.
In education, hopefully we don't do that. And also for factories that has already commitments and struggling now because of the potential higher cost of doing business. So they have to get their goods or merchandise out. But what we're doing on the 4-day work week is a lot of the factories are applying the compressed work week and staggered and splitting the shifts so we could cover the 7 days. So instead of working 8 hours a day, an employee works 4 days, longer hours, and that employee will still keep the same salary or compensation, work less days. And then there'll be another shift that will cover for the remaining weeks. So there's a lot of that shifting or managing the shifts going on now. So
How do we monitor that, sir, and make sure that the workers are compensated properly, and then there's transparency and accountability even as they reduce the number of days?
individually, the companies through their human resources department, I believe they are inherently monitoring that. As the factories and the offices are already running on lean resources
Yeah.
because of the higher costs now of operating. So we want to keep the key people who we have now in our factories, keep them and ensure that they get the right compensation. Where we are able to assist our workers is, like that 4-day work week. They have 20% less on their cost. And looking at other avenues on where the whole company can still be competitive or at least survive through this hopefully temporary crisis.
Yeah, while we're at it, I'm afraid to even ask this question, but I'll have to. Are you expecting some layoffs or reduction in workforce because of this crisis?
Not right now, Danny. Not, there's still a lot of wishful thinking, I guess you can call it, that this will be a very short conflict in the Middle East. But the heads of these companies are looking forward. What if it lasts 6 months, or what if
Yes.
it lasts a year? Now, where the biggest concern is also the rising supply chain costs or the rising cost of goods that will impact the company. And with the rising cost of goods, it will impact the workers. So that we're looking. So we're really appealing, Danny. You know, we couldn't understand why Meralco is increasing their price. We
Yes,
couldn't
we reported
understand,
that.
and 64 centavos per kilowatt hour. When you look at our power, over 62% comes from coal, which is from our partner country, Indonesia. Coal we import. Then we have renewable energy that is in place, which has the capacity now. And then we have Malampaya. So when you add all these, we I'm just talking about electricity. We
Correct.
should have enough power, existing system that we in the private sector we don't understand why. Now, of all times, we're gonna increase the Meralco price, or sorry, the power prices. And is it because of supply and demand? More supply, you increase. So I think all the industries, including the power generation industries, I believe this is the time that we should all contribute to the survival of our economy and the survival of the Filipinos who are actually working.
But what's your practical call on the electricity issue as a chamber? What can Meralco do?
For the power generations, there is a lot. Our power generation, the majority comes from coal, and it's not from any crude oil that comes from the Middle East. So on that coal, we do expect the transportation from Indonesia coming to the Philippines of this coal. Of course, we expect increases in that transportation cost that uses bunker fuel, but it shouldn't translate to a significant rise in cost, because I don't know, I think there are 20 I can't recall how many tons of coal. When you divide that by the increase of the fuel in that ship, it shouldn't really translate that much. Then we have renewable energy that's already existing. And we thank the DOE for adding and adding more capacity or generation from renewable, geothermal. So that's in place. And Malampaya. Let's not forget Malampaya for our gas, although it doesn't supply all of the gas, but it supplies the gas. And we get a lot of, the Philippine government gets a lot of revenue from Malampaya, which could be used. I just want to say this. So hopefully, our government can consider the revenue for Malampaya to be used to absorb this temporary increase in fuel. So there's a lot of sources where we believe,
Okay.
at least the private sector believes, that we can tap, at least just to absorb this increase in fuel, which should be temporary.
Okay, so either cap the electricity price increase for the month of March. They've just announced for March, no? And as Meral, as we reported, it was due to transmission or ancillary services from the grid. So you're calling, sir, for them to probably consider wag muna itong month of March.
Yes.
Maybe they can consider pushing that forward as the country is grappling with the fuel prices right now. Sir, let's talk about ayuda. Have you talked to the government about ayuda, especially to the MSMEs, and how much are you hoping for? Where are these sources going to come from?
We are, the chamber in the private sector is not 100% all for this handing out.
Okay.
We're looking for ways on how the majority, if not all, let's say the MSMEs, can benefit from proclamation or an executive order or legislation that will impact everyone. Similar, like the excise tax. Everybody benefits on reducing or suspending the excise tax, instead of giving the drivers, I believe I heard it was 6,000 pesos. I don't know how long that will go.
Yeah.
So, and by suspending the excise tax, everybody benefits. Logistics cost will remain lower, instead of the full brunt. That's why suspending the excise tax in our opinion, it's not enough. Hopefully, they can do a little bit reduction, temporary reduction of the VAT or other
Okay.
sources,
Yeah.
and to really cushion the increase of this fuel price hikes. We're also requesting in the government, we always hear about that Strait of Hormuz. Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Hormuz,
Yeah.
but only 20% of the crude oil comes from Strait of Hormuz. So there's 80% that we can possibly tap. The Philippines, there's only one refinery in the Philippines, which is the Petron refinery. And that Petron refinery definitely relies on the crude oil that comes from the Middle East. And it's the type of that light crude that the refinery is tuned to refine. But most of the fuel we import, Danny, are refined fuel. You
Yeah.
know, uh, diesel, gasoline, and such. So now we should really secure or source uh, other areas where we can work with to supply the Philippines this refined fuel. We have a lot of neighbors from South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore. I'm just talking refined fuel. And we're all, except for Korea, we're all in ASEAN, that we should really start making this a priority in the discussions. While we are hosting, the timing is good, we're hosting ASEAN, and we should really secure supply from our ASEAN neighbors like Malaysia and Singapore for this refined fuel, and Indonesia for coal for our base load power plants.
Sir, since we're on the topic, your thoughts on the oil deregulation law. Should that be revisited? Should the government start regulating and being able to put caps on the prices of fuel once again, which some analysts have said that could cause black markets to come out?
That's correct. There's the good and the bad whenever you make a decision, but certainly it should be revisited. We should look globally. The uncertainty, I think, will not end anytime soon. I'm not saying the conflict, but just the uncertainty of energy sources, food sources, and we should really revisit our energy security, our enabling laws on energy security, and others, including food. So the conflict in the Middle East, we wish it would stop soon, end soon, but there could be one in the near term somewhere. So we in the Philippines and our neighbors should really prioritize our regional security when it comes to energy, food, water, and others. Uh, with that, we should look at our old laws that
Okay.
can make it flexible now. When we look at the emergency powers that which we support giving to the president, it limits it to excise tax. So why don't we broaden it a little bit, but make it stricter on how it's applied? So we don't have to go back to Congress and asking for more special powers. What if we want to touch VAT or others? Then we have to go to that process. But if we give certain authority to certain government officials, but really be strict on how it's implemented, then we can be more flexible and enact quickly. We're giving it now to the president, and yet for 2 days now, the fuel prices have increased. See, we're like always a few days or a week behind, and now it has to go through this motion of
Yeah.
signing and approval, which we need to, and we don't want to shortcut anything. But hopefully, we would have, hindsight is 2020. We should have done it earlier, so to lessen the impact and the, quote unquote panic. So what are we gonna do with all these increases? Because it's certainly a shock when you look at a 30 or 30 to 45% increase in cost of fuel. 10%, we can still manage it, but when you look at this
This
big
is
spike in a
biggest
short
jump
period of
in
time,
history,
it's tough.
indeed. Sir,
It's tough to swallow.
last question before we let you go. How is the private sector making sure that during these difficult periods, it will be business as usual and that the companies are resilient enough to get through these times?
This conflict and this increase in potential increase in the supply chain or logistics and the goods is probably a first that will impact the private sector on this short period of time. So the private sector is looking at really some innovative ways, some innovation, and some disruptive models within the companies and each of these companies on how to mitigate and absorb these shocks temporarily. And I don't think we can be able to absorb it long term. Now, these are the large companies, Danny,
Yeah.
which has the resources. Now, when you look at the 1.2 million companies, businesses that are the micro and small, I won't even touch the medium. And that's where we are really concerned on how all this, the impact of the increases will they survive? That's the biggest concern now of the private sector,
Yeah.
which will affect all Filipinos, no matter where you are. And we're really scrambling our brains discussing how can we really help. And the bottom line immediately is let's not increase any of this fuel because increasing
More.
fuel charges will snowball or the effect is increase in goods, transportation. It really impacts everyone.
So
So
a lot of focus
it's
on
difficult.
the
It's difficult now.
yeah on the most vulnerable sectors is the most important thing. Of course, if your chamber's agenda here. Sir, thank
Yeah.
you so much and wishing you
Thank you.
all the luck as you navigate, of course, these very difficult times. Perry Ferrer, President of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Good morning, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny.